He thought it would be just a social experiment, a way to test the kindness of strangers from behind a disguise. But the moment two little girls gave him their last dollars and an apple, the millionaire CEO's carefully constructed world began to crack, and his real life quietly began. Matthew Sloan, CEO of one of the most powerful media conglomerates in the country, had grown increasingly disillusioned with the world around him. He had spent his life building an empire based on numbers, control, and image, but recently, he found himself waking up each day with a dull emptiness that his morning espresso and neatly organized agenda couldn't fix. He watched the news and saw stories of people turning their backs on each other, acts of selfishness and indifference going viral, and all he could think was that compassion had become obsolete. In meetings, he found himself staring out windows instead of listening to forecasts. He had everything, and yet he couldn't shake the feeling that he had nothing that truly mattered. The idea started as a joke. During a strategy meeting, someone mentioned authenticity as a brand trend. "Nobody trusts anything that looks perfect anymore," one executive had said. "Even brands are pretending to be vulnerable." Matthew laughed bitterly and said, "Maybe I should pretend to be homeless and see who still gives a damn." The room had gone silent, half confused, half amused. But something about the statement stuck with him long after the meeting ended. That night, he stood in front of the mirror, staring at his reflection in a $5,000 tailored suit, and wondered how long it had been since anyone had looked at him and seen a person, not a position. The next morning, without telling anyone, not his assistant, not his driver, not even his board, he packed a small backpack with old clothes, left his phone at home, and took the subway across town to a neighborhood where no one knew his name. He found a spot on a worn bench near the edge of a public park. He wore a hoodie with a torn sleeve and jeans he hadn't touched in years. He rubbed dirt across his cheeks and hands, more for effect than disguise, and wrote a simple message on a cardboard sign, "Just hungry." At first, he was amused by the novelty of it, as if he were performing in a hidden camera show no one knew about. But as the hours passed and people continued walking by, some with quick glances, others deliberately avoiding eye contact, the amusement faded. A young couple laughed loudly as they stepped around him. A man in a suit dropped a crumpled napkin into the cup near his feet, mistaking it for trash. The worst part was not being seen, it was being seen and dismissed. By late afternoon, the sun had shifted and the bench had become uncomfortable. His back ached, and he was beginning to regret the entire stunt. He wondered what point he had hoped to prove. That people were heartless. That no one gave unless it benefited them. That he himself was somehow better for noticing. And then, as he was preparing to get up and leave, he heard two small voices. High-pitched, hesitant. He looked up and saw them, two girls, no older than 6, wearing matching pink coats and pigtails. They stood in front of him, holding hands. One of them stepped forward, opened her small purse, and took out 2 crumpled $1 bills. The other pulled a red apple from her pocket. Without saying much, they placed the money and the apple in front of him. He opened his mouth to explain, to laugh, to tell them it was all a test. But nothing came out. The sincerity in their eyes silenced every defense he'd built around himself. One of them said, "Mom says we should help people if we can." Then they turned and ran back across the path, disappearing around the corner. He sat frozen on the bench, staring at the money and the apple as if they were sacred. Something cracked inside him, not from pity, but from awe. 2 children had given him everything they had, without hesitation or judgment, when no one else had even looked at him. He picked up the apple, still warm from her hands, and held it like it weighed the world. This wasn't an experiment anymore. This was something else entirely. That night, Matthew returned to his penthouse apartment a different man than the one who had left that morning. The sprawling city skyline glimmered through his floor-to-ceiling windows, but it felt distant, almost artificial, like a painted backdrop in a theater. He walked past the untouched dinner his housekeeper had left on the table, past the leather armchairs and designer decor that used to impress guests, and sank into the couch with the same tattered hoodie still clinging to his shoulders. In his hand were the two crumpled $1 bills and the apple, now slightly bruised from being carried in his pocket all day. He stared at them for a long time, as if hoping they would explain to him why two little girls had been the only people in a city of millions who had stopped to care. Sleep didn't come easily. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw them again, those two small figures standing in front of him, their voices soft, their eyes full of something he hadn't seen in years, unfiltered kindness. He thought of their tiny hands reaching into their own pockets, willing to give all they had to a stranger. He had watched countless business deals unfold, observed charitable foundations write six-figure checks in exchange for photo ops and plaques, but none of that compared to what he felt on that bench. These girls didn't give because of an audience or obligation. They gave because they saw someone who looked like he needed help, and that was enough. The next morning, Matthew skipped his usual routine. There was no gym, no espresso from his in-house machine, no conference calls or press updates. Instead, he put the same clothes back on and returned to the park. He sat on the same bench, this time without the sign, watching, waiting, hoping that they might come back. He stayed there for hours, scanning the path for flashes of pink jackets or bouncing braids, but they never appeared. He didn't leave disappointed, though. He had a plan now. He started walking the surrounding blocks, checking every corner, every playground, every fountain. By the third day, a vendor who sold hot dogs near the park told him he'd seen the twins before. "They come around here with their mom in a wheelchair," the man said, handing Matthew a bottle of water. "Nice girls. Real sweet. I think they live a few blocks down." That gave Matthew something tangible to follow. He began walking the neighborhood every afternoon, keeping his eyes open and asking quiet, polite questions. He didn't give his name or explain who he was. He didn't want a headline or attention. He just wanted to find them. Eventually, he noticed a pattern. At a small community fountain near a quieter part of the park, he spotted them again, sitting close to a woman in a wheelchair. She looked pale, exhausted, but she watched the girls with attentive eyes, offering a weak smile every time they turned to her. Matthew didn't approach them right away. He stood at a distance, observing for several minutes. He realized how out of place he looked in that moment, a man in an expensive coat and leather shoes watching children from across a park. But he didn't move. He just waited. Finally, one of the girls, he recognized her as the one who had given him the apple, looked up and saw him. Her expression changed subtly. Recognition flickered across her face, followed by hesitation. He took a step forward, slowly, keeping his hands visible, and crouched down a few feet away. "You might not remember me," he said gently. "You helped me a few days ago. With this." He held up the folded bills, still tucked safely in his wallet. "And an apple." The girls looked at each other, then at their mother. The woman nodded slowly, unsure but not afraid. Matthew spoke directly to her then, introducing himself by his full name. He saw the surprise in her eyes, but she didn't say anything right away. Instead, she listened as he told them everything, about the experiment, about what he had felt, and how he hadn't been able to stop thinking about them. The woman, whose name was Sarah, told him her side too. She had been sick for 2 years. The father of the girls had left shortly after her diagnosis. She had no family left. Her daughters, Emma and Lily, had learned to be careful with money, with hope, with trust, but not with kindness. That, they had never lost. By the end of their conversation, they were sitting together on the bench. The same bench where everything had started. This time, there were no signs, no disguises, no expectations. Just a man who had lost something real in his life and 2 girls who, unknowingly, had returned it. When they stood to leave, Sarah thanked him for stopping. He shook his head. "I should be thanking you," he said. "You reminded me what a soul looks like." Emma reached for her mother's hand, then turned back to him and said, "You looked different before." He smiled and replied, "I felt different then too." Over the next few days, Matthew couldn't stop visiting the park. What had started as a one-time experiment now felt like a quiet mission, a calling he didn't understand completely but felt compelled to answer. Each afternoon, after finishing only the most essential meetings at his office, he returned to the same bench where he had first met the girls. Sometimes Sarah and the twins were already there, sometimes they arrived later, and sometimes they didn't come at all. But on the days they did, he found himself sitting beside them longer and longer, talking about everything and nothing, about the weather, the girls' favorite cartoons, or Sarah's memories from her college years before everything changed. He discovered that Emma loved animals and wanted to be a vet, while Lily liked stars and believed the moon followed her wherever she went. Matthew brought little things for them, coloring books, puzzles, snacks from the fancy stores he used to walk past without noticing. The girls always accepted them with shy excitement, and Sarah always thanked him with the kind of grace that carried both pride and exhaustion. She didn't ask for help, not directly, but he could see the way her shoulders sagged at the end of each day, the way she gripped the arms of her wheelchair a little tighter when she coughed. One afternoon, as they sat in the shade near the fountain, Sarah finally opened up more than she had before. She told him her diagnosis in clinical terms, as if reciting a report: late-stage autoimmune failure, treatments too expensive, too delayed, too weak. She explained how the girls had adjusted quickly, too quickly. How they learned to put themselves second, to smile when she was hurting, to be brave even when they were scared. She said she had tried every possible route, charities, grants, community programs, but there were limits. Waiting lists. Closed doors. And all the while, her strength was slipping. She confessed that she had already written letters to the girls for when the time came. She kept them in a box under her bed along with a few photographs, a worn stuffed animal, and the necklace her mother had given her when she turned 18. "I don't want them to remember me sick," she whispered. "I want them to remember that I loved them enough to try everything." Matthew listened without interrupting, his hands folded, his heart pounding with a mixture of grief and disbelief. He, a man with endless access to resources, influence, and power, had done nothing while someone like Sarah had fought alone for years. And now, sitting beside her, watching the way the girls danced around the edge of the fountain, he felt something new rising in him, not just guilt, but a deep and urgent responsibility. He had the means to do something. He had no excuse not to. That evening, when he got home, he didn't go to the gym or answer emails or turn on the news. Instead, he sat in his quiet living room, opened his laptop, and began making calls. He started with a friend who specialized in rare autoimmune treatments, then called a director at one of the top hospitals in the state. He sent emails to specialists overseas, searched for trial programs, and contacted private care networks that operated with discretion and compassion. He didn't tell Sarah yet. He didn't want to give her hope until he had something real to offer. But every hour he spent building his business now felt like a shadow compared to the hours he spent trying to find a way to save one woman's life and protect the two little girls who had already changed his. By the end of the week, he had secured a place for Sarah in a renowned private facility with a care team willing to evaluate her condition immediately. Everything, transport, treatment, follow-up, would be covered. He'd instructed the staff to contact her directly but to explain only that someone anonymous had stepped in. He didn't want credit. He just wanted to know that she would be safe. And when he saw them again in the park the next day, and Sarah told him about the strange call from a clinic she never applied to, her voice full of confusion and wonder, Matthew just smiled and said, "Maybe someone finally saw what you're worth." She looked at him for a long time, and though she didn't ask, he could tell she suspected. She simply nodded and said, "Then I guess it's time to hope again." And for the first time since he'd met her, he saw her lean back and close her eyes with something close to peace. Sarah's admission to the private clinic marked a turning point not just for her, but for Matthew as well. The transfer happened quietly, without press, without statements, and without any of the fanfare he had once associated with large acts of giving. A private car took her from the modest apartment where she and the girls had been living to a carefully selected room in a facility that overlooked a peaceful garden and had nurses who didn't just monitor vitals, but learned their patients' names by heart. Matthew visited that same evening, though he didn't go inside right away. He sat in the car for almost 10 minutes, gripping the steering wheel, unsure of whether he was entering the role of a friend, a benefactor, or something deeper that he hadn't yet put into words. When he finally walked in, Sarah looked stronger already, not physically. Her illness still clung to her frame like a shadow, but emotionally, as if the very act of being treated with dignity had given her something back. She smiled when she saw him, not with surprise but with quiet understanding. "You did this," she said gently, and he didn't deny it. He sat beside her and said, "You shouldn't have had to fight so long alone." For a while, they just talked. He told her about the hospital's plans, the treatments they wanted to try, the specialists who would now be overseeing her case. She listened intently, but what moved her the most was the simple fact that someone cared enough to plan it all. She looked at him and said, "I don't know what I did to deserve this." Matthew replied, "You gave your last dollar and a piece of fruit to a man you didn't know. That kind of heart doesn't go unnoticed forever." The girls, meanwhile, had been taken in temporarily by a neighbor while Sarah settled into the clinic. Matthew made sure they had everything they needed, school supplies, groceries, even new coats for the colder weather that was approaching. He checked in every day, sometimes showing up with books or puzzles, sometimes just to ask how they were feeling. At first, they treated him like a guest, polite, warm, but slightly distant. But with each visit, they softened. One evening, Lily climbed into his lap without hesitation and asked if he had ever seen a shooting star. He said no, and she told him, "If you see one, you're supposed to make a wish for someone else." When he asked who she would wish for, she whispered, "Mommy. But now maybe also you." Matthew's apartment began to change. He found himself clearing out one of the spare rooms, not with intention but instinct, organizing it slowly with shelves and cozy blankets and a growing stack of books he thought two little girls might enjoy. He didn't tell anyone, not his board, not the press, not even his closest friends, because something about this felt sacred. This wasn't charity or a headline or a legacy project. This was personal. He began adjusting his schedule without guilt, cutting meetings short, declining events, and letting his assistant reschedule anything that didn't matter, which, he was beginning to realize, was most of it. One night, as he sat in Sarah's hospital room after the girls had gone to sleep in a small adjoining lounge, she looked at him and said, "If something happens to me, I want you to be the one who takes care of them." He didn't answer right away. He stared out the window where city lights blurred against the rain and thought about how quickly life had shifted. Just weeks ago, he had been questioning the nature of humanity. Now he was being asked to become the future of it, for two children who had restored his faith when he hadn't even known it was gone. He turned back to her and said, "Then I'll do everything I can to make sure nothing happens to you. But if it does, they'll never be alone again." Sarah smiled through tears, her eyes full of both fear and peace. That night, he didn't leave when visiting hours ended. He stayed with her until morning, listening to the sound of her breath rising and falling, watching the girls curled up on the small sofa nearby. In the quiet hours before dawn, something shifted inside him again. He wasn't standing at a distance anymore. He wasn't a bystander or a benefactor. He was part of their lives now, stitched into their story in a way he hadn't chosen but wouldn't trade for anything. Sarah's health began to decline more quickly than anyone had hoped. Despite the specialists, the tailored treatment plans, and every effort made to give her the best possible chance, her body simply couldn't keep up. Matthew visited every day, often arriving before sunrise and leaving after the girls had fallen asleep. The doctors were honest with him. They told him that while they could manage the symptoms and offer comfort, the window for recovery was closing. He didn't want to believe it. He had built a career on solving the unsolvable, negotiating outcomes that favored him, manipulating circumstances with precision. But this was something no money or strategy could fix. All he could do was be there. Sarah, for her part, remained calm. If she was afraid, she didn't show it. Instead, she began preparing, not with panic, but with painful grace. She asked Matthew to help her gather photographs into an album for the girls. She dictated letters to be given to them on future birthdays, one for when they turned 10, another for when they graduated high school. She asked him to find a way to keep their bedtime routine intact, to remember that Lily liked to be read to from the left side of the bed and that Emma always wanted the light turned off after the last sentence, not before. She gave him passwords to accounts, names of neighbors who had shown kindness, and the location of a small box under her hospital bed where she had kept their birth bracelets and baby teeth. The emotional weight of those days sat heavy on Matthew's chest. At night, after the girls had gone to sleep, he would walk the halls of the hospital or sit by Sarah's bed, silently holding her hand, afraid that if he let go, she would slip away faster. One evening, Sarah asked him, "Do you believe in fate?" and he didn't know how to answer. She smiled gently and said, "I don't know if I do either. But I do know that whatever brought you to that bench that day, it gave me peace. It gave them a future." He didn't respond with words. He just sat beside her, one hand resting over hers, while the monitors beeped steadily behind them. The girls knew more than anyone told them. Children always do. They stopped asking when their mom would come home. Instead, they began asking questions that no one ever wants to hear from children. "If mommy goes to the sky, where will we go?" Lily asked one night as Matthew tucked her in. He swallowed the lump in his throat and answered as best he could. "You'll stay with someone who loves you very much," he said. "Someone who will always keep you safe." Emma reached for his hand and didn't let go. "You mean you?" she asked. And he nodded. Not because he had planned for this, or because it felt easy, but because it had become the truth. That weekend, Sarah's breathing became shallower. The nurses increased her pain medication and dimmed the lights in her room. Matthew brought the girls to say goodnight one last time. They climbed onto her bed gently, curled beside her like they had so many times before, and whispered, "We love you more than all the stars." Sarah smiled faintly and said, "I'll be watching from the brightest one." After they were asleep again, Matthew stayed by her side through the night. She woke only once, early in the morning, looked at him with clear eyes, and said, "Don't be afraid to let them love you." Then, with a breath that trembled and faded, she was gone. The hospital room was silent for a long time after. Matthew stood beside her, feeling the stillness not just in the space, but inside himself. He had lost someone he barely had the chance to know, yet who had given him everything. He reached into the small drawer beside the bed and found the box she'd told him about. He took it gently, pressing it to his chest. He stepped into the hallway, where the girls were still asleep on the couch in the waiting room, unaware that their world had just changed forever. As he stood there watching them breathe, he made a promise, not just to Sarah, but to himself, that no matter what the future held, they would never feel abandoned, never feel unloved, never feel alone. He bent down and whispered, "We'll get through this together," though he wasn't sure if he was speaking to them, to Sarah, or to the boy he used to be before all of this began. The days following Sarah's passing moved in slow, disjointed pieces that didn't feel real. Matthew handled the arrangements in silence, unwilling to delegate any of the details to someone who hadn't known her. He chose the flowers himself, reviewed the funeral program line by line, and spent hours selecting music she had once mentioned liking in passing. He arranged for the service to be small and private, just as she would have wanted. He made sure her final resting place overlooked a quiet hill lined with trees where the girls could visit without fear or noise. The morning of the funeral, he dressed the twins carefully, buttoning their coats and braiding their hair the way he had seen Sarah do with delicate fingers that had never seemed tired until now. Emma didn't cry during the service. She sat very still, holding Lily's hand tightly, her eyes fixed on the casket as if willing it to open and reverse time. Lily leaned her head against Matthew's arm and asked if they could draw stars for their mom later. He nodded and kissed the top of her head, overwhelmed by the fragility in her voice. When it was time to speak, Matthew stood in front of a room of quiet strangers, his voice shaking as he talked about a woman who had taught him more about love and courage in weeks than he'd learned in a lifetime. He didn't talk about her illness or the hardship. He talked about how fiercely she had lived, how completely she had loved, and how two little girls had inherited her heart in full. After the burial, they returned to the apartment that no longer felt like his alone. The toys scattered in the corner, the framed drawing on the fridge, and the two pairs of shoes by the door made it clear that this was their home now. That evening, the girls asked if they could sleep in his room. He didn't hesitate. He pulled blankets onto the bed, tucked them in beside him, and told them stories until their breathing softened and their hands, once tightly clenched, slowly relaxed in sleep. He lay awake long after, staring at the ceiling, unsure how to be both protector and comforter, unsure how to grieve in front of children who needed strength more than sadness. The next few weeks were filled with quiet adjustments. He met with attorneys and social workers to make his guardianship official. He signed paperwork with his full name, heart pounding as he realized he was agreeing to raise them not as a favor to someone he lost, but because he couldn't imagine life without them. He enrolled them in a new school closer to the apartment, sat with them at the kitchen table to help with homework, learned how to make grilled cheese the way they liked it, extra crispy, but not burnt, and added bedtime to his calendar like it was the most important meeting of his day. Every night, before turning off the lights, they kissed the same photo of Sarah that now rested on the bedside table and whispered, "Good night, Mommy." Matthew listened from the hallway, wiping his eyes quietly, and wondered if he would ever feel ready for what came next. One afternoon, while cleaning out the last of Sarah's things, he found her journal. Inside were pages written in uneven handwriting, full of memories and wishes and late-night confessions. One entry read, "If something happens to me, I hope they never forget how loved they were. And if someone does step in, I hope he doesn't try to replace me. I hope he just shows up every day, even when it's hard." Matthew closed the book slowly and held it to his chest. That was the only blueprint he needed, not to be perfect, but to be present. Emma began calling him Dad one morning without warning. She was tying her shoes and asked, "Dad, can you help me with this knot?" Lily didn't look surprised. Neither did Matthew. He crouched down, helped her tie the lace, and said, "Of course." He didn't mention the name afterward, didn't mark the moment with fanfare. But that night, when the apartment was quiet again, he stood in front of the mirror and whispered the word once more, just to hear it out loud. It felt both terrifying and exactly right. He hadn't chosen this path. It had chosen him. And now that he was on it, he had no intention of turning back. Spring came slowly, and with it came color, warmth, and a kind of peace that Matthew hadn't felt in years. The apartment, once a space of marble and echoing silence, had transformed into something lived in and alive. The walls, once blank, now held drawings of stick figures and stars. The corners were cluttered with mismatched toys and forgotten socks. There was always something on the stove or in the oven, pancakes on Sunday mornings, pasta on school nights, cookies on rainy afternoons. He found himself humming without realizing it, checking backpacks before school, leaving notes in lunchboxes that said things like, "You've got this," and "I'm proud of you." Somewhere along the way, the unfamiliar had become familiar, and what started as duty had grown into love so natural he could no longer imagine his life without it. The girls were healing too, in ways that weren't always loud or visible. Emma had become more talkative, more curious. She asked big questions, sometimes at bedtime, like, "Do you think Mommy watches us from the sky?" Or, "Why do some people leave and others stay?" Matthew always answered with care, never pretending to know what he didn't. He'd say, "I think she's with us in the little things, like your laugh, or when you're kind to someone." Lily, on the other hand, became more protective. She stuck close to him in crowded places and often reached for his hand without a word. He never let go. Some nights, she'd crawl into his lap and fall asleep mid-sentence, like her small body knew it was safe now and no longer had to stay alert. One Friday afternoon, the school held a family open house. Matthew had rearranged his schedule, declined 2 important meetings, and arrived early. He wore a simple sweater and brought flowers for the teachers. When the girls saw him waiting outside their classroom, their faces lit up in a way that undid something heavy inside him. They grabbed his hands, pulling him toward their desks, showing him drawings and class projects with pride. He met other parents who didn't recognize him as the CEO of anything, just as the dad of Emma and Lily. For the first time in his adult life, he introduced himself without a title and didn't feel the need to explain who he used to be. That night, after the girls had fallen asleep, he sat on the couch with a stack of papers from work that he had no intention of reading. Instead, he opened the journal Sarah had left and reread her final entries. There were words about love, fear, and strength, but there was also a short passage that simply said, "If you're reading this now, you're doing it. You're making them feel safe. That's enough." He closed the book and sat in silence for a while, overwhelmed not by grief, but by a quiet, steady gratitude. She had trusted him with the most important part of her life, and even though he still doubted himself in quiet moments, he had never walked away. That had to count for something. The next morning, Lily woke him early, tugging on his sleeve and whispering, "We made something." He followed her sleepily to the kitchen, where Emma stood beside a plate of lumpy pancakes and a handmade card. Inside, it said, "Happy First Dad Day," in uneven letters, surrounded by drawings of hearts and stick figures holding hands. He didn't try to hide the tears that came. He picked them both up, one on each arm, and said, "This is the best day of my life." They didn't answer with words. They just hugged him tighter. Later, when the apartment was filled with the smell of syrup and laughter, he looked around and realized that this was no longer a life he was adjusting to. This was the life he had chosen, and that had chosen him right back. It wasn't built in boardrooms or on balance sheets. It was built in school pickups, in bedtime kisses, in moments of quiet love that didn't need to be earned or explained. He wasn't trying to become their father anymore. He already was. The anniversary of Sarah's passing approached with a quiet weight that hung over the household, not in sadness exactly, but in the kind of awareness that makes people pause more often, hold each other a little longer, speak with more softness. Matthew didn't plan anything formal. He didn't want the day to be marked by grief. Instead, he decided they would spend it doing something Sarah would have loved, being outside, together, free. He took the girls to a field just outside the city where the wildflowers had started blooming, and the air was filled with the early sounds of spring. They packed a simple picnic, sandwiches, apples, and a slice of the girls' favorite chocolate cake. Emma brought a framed photo of their mother and placed it in the center of the blanket like a guest of honor. Lily carried a mason jar filled with folded pieces of paper, each one a memory, a wish, or a thank you. They took turns reading them aloud. "Thank you for braiding our hair even when your hands were tired," Emma read. "Thank you for always smelling like lavender," Lily whispered. Matthew unfolded one and read, "Thank you for trusting me when you didn't have to." After each note, they dropped the paper into a small fire pit Matthew had brought with them, letting the smoke rise toward the sky like a message. They laughed between tears, telling stories about Sarah's funny expressions or how she used to sing off-key during chores. And when the jar was empty, they sat in silence, watching the flames flicker and fade. It wasn't closure, they knew that didn't exist, but it was peace, and it was shared. Back at home, life moved forward in its beautiful, chaotic rhythm. The girls were thriving. Emma had joined a school science club and had taken to building strange, wonderful things out of spare parts from Matthew's office storage. Lily started writing short poems, taping them to the fridge with magnets shaped like stars. Matthew found joy in the smallest of their rituals: morning cereal debates, impromptu dance parties in the kitchen, late-night walks to the balcony just to count how many city lights they could see. He stopped measuring time in quarters and earnings and started measuring it in bedtime stories read, bruises kissed, and laughter echoing through the apartment. One evening, Emma came home with a permission slip for a school event and said she needed to list an emergency contact. She handed it to Matthew and asked, "Should I put Dad or Mr. Sloan?" He looked at her, then at the form, and smiled. "You can put both," he said. "But only one of them knows how to pack the best lunches." She laughed, wrote Dad, and added a little heart beside it. Lily leaned over the counter and said, "When I grow up, I want to be like you." He asked, "Because I wear suits?" She shook her head and said, "Because you stayed." That night, as they all lay in the living room watching an old cartoon movie under one big blanket, Matthew thought about how different his life had become. He used to believe that success meant building an empire, being admired, feared, unreachable. But now, lying between two sleepy children who trusted him with their whole hearts, he understood what Sarah had meant when she said love wasn't earned, it was shown, every day, in the quiet moments that didn't ask for praise. He wasn't a perfect man. He had missed years he couldn't get back, had built a world that didn't include space for love until it collided with him on a park bench. But he had been given a second chance. And he had taken it. In the weeks that followed, Matthew continued to grow into his role, not as a savior, but as a father. He no longer saw his success in headlines or numbers, but in the confidence in Emma's voice when she presented at school, in the way Lily danced barefoot in the hallway, in the trust they gave him freely and without question. He had become their constant, their home, and in doing so, they had become his. And when he looked back on that day in the park, the one that started with a cardboard sign and ended with an apple and two $1 bills, he realized it hadn't been an experiment. It had been fate in disguise. The smallest act of kindness had become the foundation of an entirely new life. One where he didn't need to pretend, prove, or perform. He just needed to show up, again and again,